Welcome, baddies, to this episode of Called to Be Bad, where I talk with Ben Bouwman and Darryl Heller. Darryl Heller is Assistant Professor of History and Women and Gender Studies at Indiana University South Bend, and he's also the director of the Civil Rights Heritage Center. And Ben Bouwman is pastor at Walnut Hill Mennonite Church and is the father of two little cuties who are also my nephews. In the beginning of this episode, as usual, we talk about definitions, and Darryl and Ben provide their definitions of reparations. Darryl talks about how reparations is a process. Ben provides two biblical models for reparations, and in the end, we talk a little bit about how racism is tied to our spirituality. For your bad homework of the day, I would really appreciate and love it if you are so inclined, if you would send a word of affirmation about the podcast, something that you appreciate, something that you have learned, or any ideas that you have for the podcast in the future. I'm not feeling as motivated and excited about this podcast as I would like. And I'm a words girly, words of affirmation person. And whenever someone tells me that they really love the podcast or that they've learned a lot or they're using it for Sunday school, it means a lot and it keeps me motivated. So yeah, if you could shoot me an email or a text or something like that, that would be greatly appreciated. Okay, bye.
White people act like racism doesn't hurt them, but it does.
Okay.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, you know, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hi, Ben. Hi, Darryl.
Hey,
Hey, Mariah.
Welcome to Called to Be Bad. So this is Ben Bouwman and Darryl Heller. Ben is my brother-in-law, just so you all know my family relations here. He's Nick's twin brother. And I was talking with Ben about the podcast, and he said, you know, I've been participating in some of this reparations work. Maybe I could come on and bring someone else with me. And so then this is how we arrived today at this episode, and I'm meeting Darryl for the first time. Well, I'm so looking forward to this conversation. But first, I want to know what you all are drinking today.
well, since it's not quite noon yet, though some would say it's 5 o'clock somewhere in the world.
Yeah.
I am actually having my morning coffee still, and so just kind of continue to caffeinate.
Yeah.
I keep things quite simple with just water. No mixes, you know.
And I gotta find a way maybe to spice up the drinks, because it's turning into, because I don't, you know, in the beginning I was like, oh, look at this mug that I have, and now I've like run through all my mugs. But anyways, I have a cute little hedgehog mug with also my morning coffee. And Darryl, maybe you and I should have colluded and we like put some whiskey in our coffee or something like that. Spice up the conversation. And Ben, you can just continue to drink water. So.
You keep us straight.
Yeah. He'll keep us on the straight and narrow, which seems right. Awesome. Yeah, we'll be caffeinated, you'll be hydrated, and it'll be good. So yeah, on the podcast, we always start with definitions to establish a shared language. And so I know this may be a more complicated question, but I was wondering if one or both of you could define how you use the term reparations. It doesn't have to be the perfect dictionary definition. I know that there's many different iterations of the word, but how do you use it just in kind of your everyday language?
Darryl, you want to take this one first?
Sure. And it's not straightforward in some ways because I think different people mean different things by it. I can say how I think about it, and certainly some of the work that we're doing here in South Bend around reparations. So, I think about reparations. Its root comes from the word repair, um, and kind of repair and restore are often used synonymously. And actually, in some definitions of reparations, the definition itself encompasses repair and restore. Reparations for me is really a process. It's not a thing per se. And I think about it as a process, and that process happening within a broader restorative justice or transformative justice framework where repair implies that some harm has been done that needs to be healed and or repaired. And so if there's a harm, I think the steps and the process itself that reparations itself is a part of means that one, you have to acknowledge that a harm has occurred before you can repair it, right? You have to identify it, acknowledge it, that it's real. There's some kind of um, acknowledgement of responsibility for that harm, or a responsible party has to be identified, or and that responsible party ideally shows some remorse and apologizes, like it really acknowledges that they participated in or contributed to the harm that is before us. And then that's two steps: to acknowledging it and then taking responsibility for it. And the other, which I think what most people think of as reparations, is the repairing of that harm. Once it's identified and acknowledged, then some kind of repair. And that repair really is not is very contextual based. It's very much determined and defined, led by the party that was harmed. Like what is needed to make things right. And that's the general component. I think what people think of as reparations, but it's the only one of four steps, I think, because the step after repairing the harm is figuring out collectively how to prevent future harms from happening. And to me, that's one of the most important steps, and one that often gets left out of the conversation. Because when we think about restorative justice, and I'll just say this, that often people make a distinction between restorative justice and what others would call transformative justice, where restorative justice is more focused on harms between individuals. If I harm you, for example, then how do we make that right? What do you need as the harmed party to heal, to be repaired? Transformative justice, on the other hand, often is thought of as what are structures and systems that are producing harms. And I use the word restorative justice to mean both, because often many of the interpersonal harms have systemic and institutional roots. And I don't think we can divorce that reparations, that restoration, that repair outside of the context, the bigger context of which harms are happening in our society, particularly in a society that has such a deeply embedded racial injustice and white supremacist history. So when we talk about reparations around racial injustice, we have to, I think, be cognizant of the structural and systemic um, actions and roots that are at play.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful in two ways in my brain, that you don't separate the individual versus systemic layers. That you say they are, yeah, they're together. You have to address both. And also that you acknowledge that this is a process. This is not just like something that white people can check off their checklist and feel like, pat themselves on the back and feel like, okay, we did that, so we can move on now. You're like, no, this is part of a much broader movement, and kind of, I hear you calling us to a way of life, this kind of restorative or transformational justice way of being in the world. So yeah, thank you. Ben, do you have Anything to add to that, or
Yeah. Just to note that like there is a global definition and understanding of reparations. So like United Nation, like 5 different ways for what it means to make or do reparations. So this is certainly not like a new thing, and we have examples in our own country and around the world of like times in which reparations have done have been done. Um, and I know, I mean, people often associate like reparations, oh, it's like a blank check or whatever, and that gets back to like this is a process. It's not while it may include cash payments
Mhm.
because that is one way in our society that we show worth and value. Certainly, it's much broader than that. Um, and then just bring in one little thing from an organization called the Truth Telling Project. They're an organization that works at reparations and lifts up reparation voices. Um, their quote, which, yeah, I mean, they say reparations is the midpoint between truth telling and reconciliation, um, which I think, and I agree with Darryl that like reparations is probably includes both truth telling and reconciliation, but it gets at the idea of like first we need to tell the truth about the harm that happened and who benefited from it. Then we work at the repair, and only then can we actually, if we want to get to reconciliation, we have to do those steps. We
Mhm.
can't immediately get into the you know everything's good now step.
yeah.
Okay, Ben, can you say more about what reconciliation looks like and how you think about that? That last piece, like
Yeah, I mean, I would say reconciliation would be right relationship.
mhm,
Um, it would be certainly the group, the party that has been harmed is able to say, yes, um, I can see that this group or this entity or this person has taken responsibility, is working at remedying that harm, um, and to say let's I mean we certainly can't erase the past and we don't want to, but what is the best way of moving forward?
mhm,
And we get at that place where um, the past is no longer, I don't know, keeping anyone back,
mhm,
but we're to move forward as equals, as people who want to
mhm,
create the sort of society that of equity that we want, that we all desire.
mhm. Yeah, no, part of that's helpful. I mean, because I think about that in the necessity in part of that reconciliation involving some structural transformation often, because how do we create the right relationships when institutions themselves continue to remain embedded with racism and sexism and homophobia and misogyny and like we really need to challenge the structures that that's from policing to the educational system to healthcare, like all of those structures that replicate the harms.
Right.
So yeah.
Reparation is way more than getting white people to not be racist. Reparations is way more than white people having a really good relationship with a person of color. Reparations is getting at that the way in which white supremacy has been baked into our system, and
Hmm.
it operates often in very hidden ways, but also very seen ways if you're willing to have eyes to see. Um, so ingrained into the system that we have to work at that systemic level in order to have real progress.
Do you think yeah, I'm thinking about there was this Mitch McConnell clip that I saw as part of the podcast that Ben sent me, where he talked about how he was like, well, no one around here has been an active player in harming black people in slavery, etc. And he, as an individual, is part of a system that has broadly erased the harms of slavery. I'm just kind of playing at the individual versus systemic. Like, is there a place for like your in part of reparations for the individual to say like, okay, no, I was not part of this, and I am still caught up in this
Mhm.
system, and I'm still complicit because I'm a part of it. Does that make sense where I'm going there?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense because, I mean, it's questionable whether Mitch McConnell personally has been involved in harming black people. I
Well,
think,
that's what they
I
said.
think,
They said
I
that
think
his
we can make an
family,
argument
yeah, his
otherwise.
family owned a plantation or something like that. Yeah.
Well,
Anyway, sorry,
and this,
continue.
no, 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 that's all good because there's a couple of things I think it's important to nuance in this, but one is that, we talk about whether I was a direct participant in harming folks. Like whether and his family may or may not have owned slaves, but as a white person in America, simply because of the luck of birth, being born white, and the structure and history of systemic racism, white people benefit from that, regardless of their personal and direct participation in it. Um, this just a simple example is the the multiple years when black workers were excluded from craft unions, for example, and the inability to compete on the labor market meant that white people had an advantage employment wise just in terms of the kind of jobs they could get because they didn't have the competition or of black people and other folks who were just as qualified but were fully excluded. So it narrowed the pool and gave them unequal access to those opportunities. And that happens on multiple levels, and we can talk about it in many different ways. But white skin privilege is a real thing, and it's a real thing because of the way the society has dehumanized and denigrated black skin, which just by its nature has produced a whole pathway of advantages to white people. And so that manifests in everything from the wealth gap to health disparities to educational outcome disparities, where white people continually benefit um, just because they're white in this society. So that's one way I would respond.
Mhm.
And I don't know, Ben, your thoughts.
Yeah, certainly. Um, I think with that Mitch McConnell quote, he talked about like slavery, right? Like I didn't own slaves, um, which that sort of comment is ignorant for a number of reasons. But certainly, uh, the harm did not end with Emancipation Proclamation. Like white supremacy simply just took different forms, but was equally as devastating, for decades after Emancipation Proclamation. Um, so yeah, the harm has been ongoing for years and years and years and years, and it's taken so many different forms. It's been at the federal level, the state level, the local level. It's been businesses. It's been everyday citizens. Like it's so comprehensive, um, and it's not the distant past. It still happens today, but even like the late 60s is not that long ago. My parents were born in the 50s, right? So this is not a long time ago, and we've, as a country, have failed to recognize like the lasting effects of harm. Like for some reason, it seems like think, oh, the harm stopped, everything's good. But it's like no, generations of harm have caused lasting effects, and unless we address those lasting effects, nothing's going to happen. Um,
Mm.
Malcolm X has a quote. He says, if you stick a 9-inch knife into someone's back and you pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it all the way out, that still is not progress. Progress is healing the wound that was caused by the knife. And so while in many ways we've ended a lot of the formal means of discrimination in this country, we have never gone back and tried to address the wound that has occurred. And when you have a significant wound, it doesn't heal on its own. Ignoring a wound will not cause healing. It'll get worse. It'll get infected. You have to address the wound that was caused.
Yeah, and let me just say, because I think this is really important, and this can be a little controversial to some extent. Like I think that when we talk about reparations, often people like Mitch McConnell say, "Well, I didn't slavery. We ended slavery. So what are you complaining about?" I think that, and people often say that the demand for reparations is for slavery, and I would say it's actually not for I think of reparations not for slavery, but what happened after slavery ended. Because I think, again, as a 19th century historian, I think about this a lot. Think of what the world would look like if, at the end of the Civil War in 1865, the country had actually acknowledged the harm that it had done to 4 million newly freed people over centuries, 246 years. That's roughly 12 generations of people that had been enslaved. What if there had been some reconciliation at that point, that these 4 million people were brought into the body politic? The promise of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment had actually been realized in that newly free people were given land, which they had earned, and this space to heal in the ways that they chose for themselves to heal, unmolested, unfettered, and had been allowed to vote and participate in the political process, where in multiple counties in the South, they were the majority and could have chosen representatives that had their interests at heart. Um, and that we had continued that process through today. Like if we had made that reconciliation today, we'd have a very different world. We'd have a very different set of race relations. But as Ben said, that didn't happen. I mean, in fact, what happened was that white supremacy doubled down on itself after slavery. There was this little short window called Reconstruction that lasted about 7 years before white supremacy really reasserted itself. And what we ended up with was, another several generations of Jim Crow that continued to set Black people backwards, while white people continue to advance. And if we don't, and that's part of the festering wound that I think Ben is referring to, that we as a country and as a society won't acknowledge. And if we don't acknowledge that harm, we don't acknowledge that reality, it's really hard to even have a conversation about reconciliation or reparations, because we're almost talking two different languages because we're operating almost from two different worldviews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and the immediate jump to defensiveness of like, well, I'm not, I didn't own slaves or whatever. It shuts down that conversation, and it cuts off the opportunities to acknowledge harm, which is probably why that comes up so often, because it's the easy way out. And so I appreciate you taking us past that and saying, it's not even necessarily about slavery, it's about what happened afterwards. And also moving us just from like the way I personally or anyone personally played a role in harm, to acknowledging the ways that we personally have benefited from these systems of harm, from this system of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
Flipping it from like I did active harm to I am actively benefiting from this system. That flipped something in my brain. So thank you. I keep thinking about I'm reading this book called Babel by R.F. Kwong. Have either of you heard of it?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
It's amazing. It's about how empires use language to colonize and use education to perpetuate white supremacy. It brought to life white supremacy in a way that I just haven't experienced before. Anyways, I can't explain the whole thing, but it's just I recommend that book. I'm wondering if, I mean, you kind of got a little bit at this at why reparations. But do you have any sort of like elevator speech of if you're just like trying to say like, no, this is actually something beneficial that you give, or have we kind of covered why reparations?
Well, I'll say one thing is that one of the misnomers and something that I don't think is
Mm.
fully recognized, white people act like racism doesn't hurt them, but it
Mm.
does. I mean, and so this will touch this on the spiritual side of it. Um,
Yes, please go there.
Whenever someone dehumanizes another person, they're actually dehumanizing themselves as well. I think that the inability to acknowledge the humanity in someone else, I think says something about how one sees their own humanity. And I can say more about that, but if we don't acknowledge the harm on multiple levels and across the board, um, for example, I'll just use another historical example is that the NAACP had a postcard of a lynching that they circulated. It was the lynching of Reuben Stacy. I think he was a 17-year-old black black kid who was accused of assaulting a white woman. It turned out he didn't. But they use an image of him hanging dead with a crowd of white people around him. There's two white men and there's three white children. And the children are half smiling. Actually, it's almost entertainment of sorts. And what the NAACP in their card, what they say is, don't look at the dead body. Don't look at Reuben. He's dead. There's nothing that can be done for him now. But look at the children. What are we raising in terms of young people who think who grow up believing that this is a normalized, okay human behavior to kill and torture another person? What does that say, and what kind of damage does that do to them, to their psyche, to their own sense of place in the world? Um, and that's kind of inestimable, the bowl. The degree that walking around believing in superior, that one is superior just because the accident of birth and the particular phenotype that and lack thereof of melanin one has makes one superior. Like, how insane is that if you just look at that or think about that on a human level? And what does that say about the person who carries that belief? So that's one side, I think, of racism and white supremacy that's not talked about. Where there's maybe like some material benefits, but on the spiritual and human level, it's incredibly harmful and dehumanizing.
Yeah, Ben, do you have more to add on kind of like the um theological, spiritual side of reparations work?
Um, yeah, I'll bring in a Bible passage here or two.
Like a good pastor would.
So yeah, there's a book called Reparations: A Christian Call for Repentance and Repair, um, and they use two stories within Scripture primarily to frame their work on reparations and repair and restoration. One is the story of Zacchaeus, who recognizes the harm that he's done and is willing to pay back. Um, that's an instance where Zacchaeus has like directly done the harm, um, and paying it back. And so there's a way in which white people say like, I haven't directly done this. So the other story that they use is the parable of the Good Samaritan, to show like, regardless of whether I am the one who directly harmed this person who's lying beaten at the side of the road, it is my responsibility as a human being to have compassion and care for someone who has been so badly harmed. Um, so as a white person, like even if I haven't benefited from white supremacy, like our call as fellow human beings is to care about the dignity and worth of every single person, and that is reason enough to do it. And then as a Christian, the thread throughout Scripture of caring for the oppressed, defending the oppressed, and when you look at this history, it has been one of repeated and multiple forms of oppression. So again, like any and every Christian should care about this work because God demands it. Like the work of Christians is to work at like who is being oppressed, who has been oppressed, and how can we step in to help. And then on top of that, as a white person, like as we talked about briefly, like all the ways in which I have benefited. My focus has not exclusively been on, but has looked quite a bit at like the racial wealth gap and what has led to that. In 2020, like the median net worth of a black household was like around $17,000, and the median net worth of a white household was around like $171,000. So there's about a tenfold difference there in the net worth. And median is like if you line up, all of the black households and you pick the family in the middle, or you line up all the white households and pick the family in the middle, and you compare those to each other. So you have this. This is where we get to the lasting some of the lasting harm, and the racial wealth gap is just one area that we could look at. We can look at policing. We can look at employment, health, housing. Like there's so many areas in which we can see that the harm has continued on. So when you see a statistic like the racial wealth gap, where the white household has about 10 times more wealth than a black household, you can look at that and say, okay, either white people are superior and they're better at getting and managing and investing money, or you can say, that systemic racism is true, and there have been decades and generations of harm that have happened that have led us to where we are today. And so as I looked at the history, I can look at my own life and see the multiple ways in which I have benefited. The neighborhoods I grew up in, what educational and banking resources I've been able to access, jobs that have been opened up. When white people have all of the top jobs, all of the good paying jobs, and white people mostly know white people, well, who are they going to give those good jobs to? White people that they know. So this is where you get into how the system operates and works. I think one of the important pieces to be aware of is the Great Migration, which is when I think it was about 2/3 of the African American population was moving out of the rural South and moving into the city and into the North, looking for jobs and escaping the racial terrorism of the South. And in that process, you then expose the racism of the North and of cities. And in combination with governmental policies, you're directing Black people to smaller and smaller neighborhoods where they're crammed for space and housing, because white people don't want Black people in their neighborhoods. And so by doing that, they're able to keep their housing values elevated. And because of the way our system works with local taxes, you're able to attract good businesses. All of those taxes go to pay schools. And so you have what was government-sponsored segregation, which you still see these patterns today. It's so ingrained into the system. And it's not like something that we're taught in our schools growing up. It's something that we need to educate one another on, because the temptation is to forget it and say, oh, that was the past. it's not my fault, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and then just what often isn't talking with often not talked about as well is that the kind of benefits of whiteness aren't just like the overt ones you can think about, but there's the negative benefits. Like for example, white people by and large don't have to worry about whether they'll be killed if they're stopped by the police. Um, like that's somewhere a possibility. We've seen that over and over and over again. Or, one of the examples that been used is that as a white person, you don't have to worry about if you go into a store, is that person following me because I'm black, or is that person following me because they have a question? All of the ways that racism negatively affects black people, even indirectly, and just the need to kind of be constantly vigilant in how you are in the world. I mean, an example for me is that the first time I went to Europe, like here in America, like here in my daily life, I have a little buzz in the back of my head that never shuts off, that just always reminds me I'm a black person in America. I'm not always conscious of it. I mean, I become very conscious when I see a blue light behind me. But generally, when I'm walking the streets, I don't think about it, but it's there. Um, and the first time I went to Europe, I went to Amsterdam, and like within the day, there was a silence I hadn't recognized before because I wasn't concerned about being black in the Netherlands. I was more concerned about being an American, how I'd be perceived as an American than I was, but it wasn't racialized, and it was a phenomenally new experience for me. And recognizing that the moment I set foot back on U.S. soil, that little buzz in the back of my head turned itself back on instinctively. Because if it's not there, then I'm just incredibly vulnerable as a black person. And that's something white people don't have to worry about, and that doesn't exist for white people. And so some of the health disparities are because that creates an ongoing and constant level of stress for black people that produces things like diabetes and high blood pressure and the things that are, we think of as genetic, and the epigenetics is real, that is passed down across generations. And, when black parents sit their black son down and have the talk, um, again, is something that white people and white parents don't have to do with their children or worry about their children when they go out. And I have a 16-year-old son that I think about, and he lives in Chicago, and Chicago is notorious in many ways for how it treats young black men because he lives on the South Side. That I worry about him, and I have to think about that in ways that, again, the kind of negative benefit of not having to think about those things or carry that extra burden around all the time that exists for white people that's not available to black people.
Yeah. As you were talking, I immediately thought about generational trauma and how our bodies store that trauma.
Yes,
The book My Grandmother's
my
Hands
goodness,
talks
yes.
exactly about that. And is really beautiful. And earlier when you were talking about the Good Samaritan, and I was picturing myself like walking on a street and seeing someone who is like, has like a bloody nose or a bloody lip, and what you are shifting us from is from the like, it wasn't me, like I didn't hit this person, to how can I help?
Mhm.
And again, that, I don't know, it's just these like subtle psychological shifts to move us away from defensiveness towards um yeah, this kind of transformation, this call for transformation.
And
um
one caution we should get into is like to avoid the white saviorism, which I know you've talked about before on the podcast. But
Mhm.
um, the Good Samaritan is like, okay, obviously, if someone has been medically hurt, we know pretty clearly that they need like medical help. You know, because white supremacy has harmed in so many different ways. White people better not come and say like, this is what healing looks like, or this is what reparations is. Getting back to the definition, that the people who have been harmed, people of color, Black people, are the ones who get to say what healing looks like, what restoration looks like, what reparations looks like.
It'd be like if the white saviorism would be like the person is bleeding from their nose and they start like furiously like casting up their arm and being like, I'm helping you, and they're like, no, it's my nose that's bleeding. Like, yeah, no, that's a good reminder. Thank you. So do one or both of you have some sort of vision for how reparations can be lived out? Do you have like a 5-step plan, or is this again calling us to a shift in posture for how we live out our lives, or some combination of both?
You gonna go, Ben?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of conversation that, like, the ultimate thing that is needed is a federal reparations program. Like, the federal government is the one that is like most culpable and has the most ability to address things. There's been a bill that a Black senator, John Conyers, I believe,
Yes.
introduced beginning in 1989 and introduced for every year after that, and then has now been picked up by other Black senators and Congress people, but has never gotten a full vote on the House. But it's a bill to study and make specific proposals for how to remedy the harms at the federal level. I personally don't have a lot of hope that it will get passed at a federal level in any near future. I certainly hope it does, and you never know the way movements work and how things shift. But because of the lack of the government's action, I think because harm has been done at all levels of society, there are plenty of ways in which we can work at reparations as we continue to ask the government to do what it needs to do. So you see that, like the state of California, looking at what does reparations look like there. You see cities around our country, Evanston, St. Louis, Darryl can talk about South Bend, that are looking at, okay, what harm was done at the city level and how can we do that? You have universities around the country who have learned that they benefited from slavery and have tried to look at what reparations looks like there. I know of white churches who are looking at, what does it mean for us to work at repair? I recently asked the congregation I pastor if we can set aside, I mean, it's a small amount, but it's a start, to say, like, can 1% of our budget every year be given like reparative giving? And that would be split between kind of indigenous work and Black work. So things can happen at the congregational level, and then certainly at the individual personal level, knowing that our family has benefited from white supremacy, we are giving a monthly reoccurring donation to Black-led organizations that are working at reparations or justice and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think any and all of that is great to get into this work of reparations. Darryl, why don't you take it from here?
Yeah, no, all of those are important, and I think that it's critical, and it's critical and troubling in our current moment, because unless we learn the full scope and breadth of our national history, I don't have much hope either. Because we can't even talk to one another. Like those the Mitch McConnells and those folk, they're operating from a very particular worldview that's, I think, extremely narrow and and tragically uninformed. Um, but that really informs the actions that they do and the positions that they hold. And while folks like us, the three of us, and folks who actually have a better sense and a deeper sense of the racial harm that has been historically produced and continued have a different worldview. And so how can we even talk to one another? So I think one of the most important things we have to do going forward is really about education and about learning and teaching that history, the full history of this country. I was listening to something last night where someone said, this country's done some amazing things. Just, I mean, I'm not a big patriot, but the United States has done some amazing things. It's a great country in many ways, but it's done some atrocious, has committed some atrocities that if we don't fully acknowledge them, then we can't move forward, we can't heal, we can't even begin to reconcile. So education is one. And I think with Ben as well, given the political division that we have, I don't see the national government doing anything. So I think the direction that a lot of folks, including here in South Bend, is how can we address this on a local level? Because while the nation itself has to be held accountable for slavery and its aftermath, there was national policies, but those national policies were implemented on local levels. And local institutions could have done something different, and they didn't. And they need to be held accountable for that. Um, so here in South Bend just initiated a Reparatory Justice Commission to begin looking at what reparations would look like here within our local jurisdiction. And that commission is looking at all of the various historical injustices around housing, around education, around healthcare, around employment, the production of the wealth gap, policing and the criminal legal system in ways that there's been disparities in all of that. And it's really complex, right? Because there's no one size fits all and there's no easy answers to it. But unless we engage the conversations, we won't ever have a shot at finding any answers. And it's not just about shifting internally our views and our perspectives. I think that we don't change outside of the acts that we do. It's what we do that changes us. And so we have to engage with each other differently across racial lines because I think it's important to realize that the injustices that happen to Black people are not disconnected from the oppression of women, or is not different than the heteronormativity that produces transphobia and homophobia. I think they're all of a cloth. And the most egregious and long-standing harms have happened to people of color, but women. And so, and I teach gender studies, and really push my students to think about um, when we think if we really think about wanting to support women, we have to address the issues of Black women, the most oppressed sector of women. If we talk about, Black Lives Matter, we have to address the fact that there are gay Black people, and we have to fight, as Black people, we have to fight homophobia, because it's affecting people in our community. I mean, they're not disconnected. So part of, I think, the repertory work and the transformations that need to happen, on those structural and systemic levels, has to have that recognition as a central component. And we have to do more than just locate it as we're going to do a one-time payment, but it is that process and that transformation of our structures and institutions and systems that replicate harms across multiple levels and across multiple groups. But we have to, if we care about Black people, we have to care about all of the other things that are happening to people as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I hear you calling us to an intersectional and an educational approach to reparations, to acknowledging all the webs of interconnectedness. And if we were all better educated and a better kind of philosophy when it comes to reparations, then that could build up to a kind of federal level. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, and I want to say I think that it's really important because of the history of this country, because I'm actually working on on kind of an academic piece on
Mm.
how white supremacy became embedded in in our legal system in the 19th
Mm.
century, from the nation's founding in 1787. Kind of what I'm actually looking at more specifically is the Dred Scott decision that removes citizenship from all Black people, both enslaved
Mm.
and free, the possibility of citizenship in 1857, how that decision was very much rooted in the founding of the country. It's kind of thought of as one of the most egregious, misuses of judicial power. I personally think that they're just telling the truth. I think that what that decision, and if you ever have a chance to read it, it's literally the first 15 pages, is just saying basically the founding fathers did not think of Black people as part of we the people. That in the founding document, it was a nation founded explicitly, and I want to emphasize explicitly for white people. Despite the fact that we're taught that we the people actually included all of us, it didn't. Um, and that when Thomas Jefferson wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that equality was only equality among white people in Jefferson's mind, because Jefferson could not have thought of Black people as equal if he enslaved them. You just can't enslave your equals. Um, and so clearly that there is this disconnect. That's part of the history. And so when I think about the intersectionality, I don't want to lose sight, and I don't want to water down that racial justice needs to be at the center of that. And in the absence of racial justice being at the center of it, we're going to continue to go down the side road and not the main road to repair.
Yeah. Yeah. Any final thoughts?
I mean, I would say that this is would be my elevator statement
There you
is
go. Yeah. Yeah.
is that there can be no national healing. There can be no racial healing as a nation unless we address the issue of reparations. That we will that wound has been so, I think graphically said, will continue to fester if we
Mm.
don't address this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I will say that some of that healing is painful. It's
Right. Yeah.
it's not, and it's complicated, but unless we do that painful part of it, we won't heal. And so
Mm.
that's not to say that this is going to be easy and painless.
Mm-hmm.
People are going to have to make sacrifices,
Yeah.
and really make some real significant changes.
Mm.
But that's part of the healing process.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just highlight again what Darryl said, the education piece. That's what propelled me into this work, and that's where you begin to feel it more personally, right? I mean, it goes from this just kind of like abstract harm out there to like it's so hard to read some of this stuff because what happened was just so awful. But we can't look away like that's one of the benefits, right? I mean, white people can choose to not look at that, but like take care of yourself. This whole problem is not on one white person. But take care of yourself so that you can keep reading and learning and educating. I think it's important for people to learn the history of kind of their local area and how that fits into the bigger context as well. But yeah, every neighborhood, every place has its own story, and it's important to know that history, to learn that history.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you to both of you for the work that you've done, the work that you continue to do. And any way the podcast can support that, I will do my best. Well, it's tradition on the podcast to end with a blessing. So would it be okay, Ben and Darryl, if I bless you and all of our baddies out there listening or watching?
I love it, and I have lived my life being bad, so I'm down with that.
Yes, I love it. I love it. Um, Amazing. Well, Ben and Darryl, and all of you baddies out there, may you go from this episode inspired to live. I wanted to say live badly, as in, don't turn away. Face what is going on. Continue to learn. From the Black people in your communities, from people of color who have been calling for reparations for so long. May we open up our hearts and minds, and may we push for not only individual but systemic change, transformation. Amen.
Our people.
Oh, people. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Darryl, it was really nice meeting you. Yeah, I want to come take your class. I want to come see your work or read your work, and yeah. Are you on social media much? I guess I need to do my good podcaster question. Where can we find your work, Darryl and Ben?
You have to come to South Bend.
Okay. Buy a ticket, come to South Bend.
I have very self-consciously not don't do social media.
Okay, yeah.
I'm one of those.
Sure. I mean, yeah. Yeah. Ben,
Yes.
you also are not really on social media, are you?
Not going to find me on social media, no.
You're like, please don't find me.
I put together a humble little website page on reparations on our church website. So if you go to WalnutHillMennoniteChurch.com, I didn't want it to be overwhelming, so there's just a few links there just to get started on. If you're interested in more, there's a podcast on reparations. There's a page that looks at kind of some of the economic policies that have been put in place to advantage whites and disadvantage blacks, and so yeah, that's one place that, and you can contact me if you want to through that page.
Okay.
And I do have and there's an article in the Hastings Law Journal that I published last year,
Okay.
or earlier this year, and it's actually looking at the relationship between reparations and restorative justice.
Oh, okay.
They're kind of like trying to tease that out a little bit, how important they are to kind of consider together, because it really embodies the process, as opposed to paying a check or something like that.
Sure. Makes sense. Great. Well, I will compile some links, and yeah, thank you for your time, for coming on. And yeah, Darryl, I love that you're always bad. So that's great. Yeah, but
I'm
thank
only
you
a
for
historian. I was becoming a historian was even another expression of being bad.
a bad historian. Maybe we'll have to have you back on and talk about all your historian stuff. That would be great. Bad historian. I'm writing it down. Awesome. Well, that's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.